The draft in any sport is always an exciting time for players and fans. It is the night in which franchises select a player that can potentially make or break the next few years of the team who selects them. And sometimes the teams win the lottery, and sometimes they miss the mark altogether. In the 2011 NBA draft, quite a few teams did just that, and one team found a diamond in the rough. In today's video, we are going to be dissecting the 2011 NBA draft to see who hit it big and found that diamond, and who whiffed on their opportunity. Who was the biggest sleeper pick? It is always fun to look back on draft classes and be stunned at the talent the teams willingly passed over. Of course, on the draft floor, it is easy to look at players' draft reports and label them a bust or a gem before they even step foot on an NBA floor. However, in the 2011 NBA draft, it is honestly stunning to see the name that was on the board come the 30th pick, Jimmy Butler. Butler was left at number 30, and of course, the Chicago Bulls were lucky enough and smart enough to select him with their pick. But how was it that a player of this caliber slipped this far down the draft board? Surely this many GMs couldn't have been this wrong about a player, right? According to his ESPN draft analysis, he was easy to look over when comparing him to some of the players selected before him. For starters, Butler is not particularly big for an NBA player. At 6'7", he is definitely not one of the tallest people in the association, and his athleticism was not particularly amazing when he was entering the draft. He was labeled as a tweener, which essentially is basketball slang for a player who may not be good enough to make it in the NBA in a position. He was decent at multiple positions and was not good enough at one specific aspect of the game to carve out a niche in the NBA. Obviously, that turned out to be a ridiculous take, but at the time it held him down from being selected earlier. His draft report did point out the things that he was good at, like his ability to score from in close and out far, along with his smoothness with the ball and his innate ability to generate offense. Of course, it was the fact that he could score from either close or far out that made him seem like a bust in both categories rather than a threat in both categories. The only solidified pros that were attached to Butler via his draft report were the fact that he was a solid defender and a solid rebounder. Of course, neither of those things are what you want to draft for early in the first round, especially with all of the exciting talents that was left on the board in the 2011 draft. So who went before Butler in the draft, and what weapons did they have? Obviously, Butler turned out to be one of the biggest steals in NBA draft history, but how big of a steal was it? In order to determine that, we would have to look at who was taken before Butler and what weapons they had at the draft, and if those weapons translated to the NBA. In the case of the first overall pick, Kyrie Irving, I would say that his skill set translated very easily to the NBA. His speed and his vision alone are enough to say that he is an elite NBA talent, and you cannot blame the Cavs for going with Irving first overall in 2011. He ended up capturing a championship with LeBron later in his career, and has been a very valuable asset ever since. While he has had some downtimes and was held off the floor a great deal during the 2021 and 2022 COVID-affected seasons, he was clearly the right choice at number 1 at the time, and cannot be labeled as a bust after winning a championship ring and 6 All-Star nods. However, Butler would have been a much better selection at number 2 overall compared to the player who actually went 2nd overall. The Minnesota Timberwolves selected Derek Williams with the 2nd overall selection, and it turned out to be the first bust of the 2011 draft. While Williams wasn't the worst player taken in the draft, he was definitely not a first-round talent. Williams only scored 3,809 points in his 7 seasons in the NBA. He played for 6 teams in those 7 seasons, failing to find a role or a niche in the league, which eventually spurred him to go overseas to play the game he loves. At 3rd overall, the Utah Jazz selected Enes Freedom, who probably cannot be labeled as a bust, but it is clear that Butler would have been a much better pick at his spot. Freedom does have 8,349 points during his career, but he has 5,822 rebounds during his career, which is more than the 1st and 2nd overall picks combined. Again, teams don't draft for rebounders and defensively smart players in the top 3, but Freedom definitely had a role in the NBA. So in the top 3 picks, 2 players can be labeled as a bust, or a player that was simply selected too high. So who should have gone before these players, and where should Jimmy Butler have gone? How much talent was in the 2011 draft? The first round of the 2011 draft especially was packed with talent that has stamped their mark on the league. Obviously, this had to have been a decent class if Jimmy Butler was picked with the 30th overall selection, but he was not the only player to be glanced over by teams and picked a bit later than they probably should have been, but how many of them are better than Jimmy Butler? The first notable player to be selected way later than they should have been is Kemba Walker, who was selected 9th overall by the Charlotte Hornets. Walker actually leads the draft class in points with an astounding 14,414 points. None of the 7 players selected between himself and Kyrie Irving are even close to his talent, which probably means that he should have been at the very least the 2nd overall pick in this class. However, a great deal of the talented players in this class have been plagued with injuries like the player selected by the Indiana Pacers at 15th overall, Kawhi Leonard. Leonard has 11,110 points, despite having played almost 200 less games and almost 7,000 less minutes played than Kemba Walker. Of course, Leonard's value is greatly boosted by his defensive prowess, and now with the resume that he has created for himself, he should have been selected much higher than he originally was. The same is the case for some other amazing players that were selected in this class like Klay Thompson, Nikola Vucevic, Tobias Harris, Reggie Jackson, and Isaiah Thomas, who was actually selected with the very last pick in the draft. So now that we have the knowledge and the stats, who do we think should have been selected higher and who maybe should have been left off the board? What would a 2011 NBA redraft look like? As bad as I'm sure the Jazz, Timberwolves, Hornets, and Wizards would like to have a second chance at the 2011 NBA draft, they will never be able to do so. However, we have a different luxury. So who would go where in a 2011 redraft? Well, I think it's pretty clear, but Kawhi Leonard would have to go first overall. He is simply too good to overlook, and despite his injury history, his skill and his game-changing abilities on both sides of the ball are too hard to pass up on. At number 2 would be Klay Thompson. His three-point ability would have been a game-changer for the Timberwolves, especially back in 2011, and his stellar defense makes him one of the best players in this draft. At number 3, the Utah Jazz should have gone with Jimmy Butler. While we highlighted him in this video, it is clear that he should have gone in the top 5 at the very least, so it makes sense that we find him here in the top 3. You could argue that he should be number 2, however. The Timberwolves were starving for an elite shooter, and Klay would have provided that to the Wolves in a way that Butler probably couldn't. However, pick 30 all the way down to pick 3 is a pretty huge jump, and it is one that Butler earned. He stands above 58 of the 60 players drafted in this class, and that's pretty good in our books. However, 4th overall in this redraft would be Kyrie Irving, the player who originally went 1st overall. Irving would fall to these 3 players, but yet he still would have remained on the Cavs, as they had picks 1, 4, and 54 in the 2011 draft. Could you imagine a team with Leonard, Irving, and James? I mean, the Cavs did become one of the best teams in the league with James and Irving, but the addition of Leonard would have made this team one of the best squads in the league, even possibly to this day. At 5th overall in this alternative timeline redraft, we have Kemba Walker, who would have found himself north of the border with the Toronto Raptors. Walker would have changed this team big time, and most likely would have brought this squad closer to the finals much faster than they eventually found themselves. A team with Walker and Leonard would have been a disgusting franchise, and Walker's presence may have been enough for Leonard to stay in the 6, but of course we will never know. That's all we have for you guys today on the channel. Thank you all so much for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed the content, and we'll see you all in the next video.